Our subject today is why emperors collected, and more particularly, why did Sung Dynasty emperors invest significant time and enormous resources into forming art collections? There are many reasons, one surely being just the pleasure of beautiful objects and the fun of collecting. I know about that personally, but I will limit this talk to 4 important points. That objects could demonstrate legitimacy. They could declare that one had secured heaven's favor, and that in particular was focused on bronze vessels, but also other things. And then another reason was to setting the cultural agenda. And in establishing the cultural agenda, there was a subtle, but sometimes not so subtle, competition between the court and the educated elite who were the officials who served the court. So the question was, who really establishes artistic and cultural norms? And then there's documenting successes, whether they're military or social, and we'll look at a beautiful painting by Wang Ximeng, the 1,000 Miles on the Yangtze River. And documenting successes also includes commemorating special events, commemorating, in Huizong's case, auspicious signs. And then instructing. There were didactic paintings that particularly instructed women how to behave, but also there were guides for children and for heir apparents. Now, the Sung Dynasty was founded in 960, and followed half a century of warfare after the dissolution of the great Tang Dynasty, which was kind of the model for many succeeding dynasties. There was always the sense that China should be one entity, have one government. So the core of the Sung Dynasty imperial collections was actually formed by Taizu. Even though he wasn't a collector, he was a great military general. But when he defeated someone, he would confiscate their collections and carry them off to Kaifeng, and also appropriate their artists, bring their artists to the capital to decorate buildings, to paint screens, and confiscate books, and so on. So that enriched the imperial collections enormously. One reason that emperors felt actually obliged to collect was that there was a story of great tripods, 9 great tripods that were owned by the Zhou dynasty. And Qin Shi Huang tried to recover one of them from the Si River, an incident that's recorded by the grand historian Sima Qian. The incident was in 219 BCE, so a very long time ago, but this illustration of the retrieval of the bronze ding is somewhat apocryphal. It's in a Shandong carved stone that dates to a couple centuries later. But in Sima Qian's telling, the first emperor believed that the possession of the tripods would give him the prestige of the Zhou dynasty. And bronze vessels, of course, were really critical in the veneration of ancestors. And keeping your ancestors happy was critical to the success of your dynasty, because they could intervene for you. So these bronze vessels, I'll show you a few in a moment, held grain and wheat that would seduce the spirits into coming into the ceremonies you were performing, and then hopefully they would help with your requests. In this little illustration, the vessel is being lifted by a rope, and it's being pulled by fellows who then fall back here when miraculously a dragon rises from the waves and snaps the rope. So here we see fellows on a little boat with a pole to guide it up, but it's all thwarted. And Sima Qian says in his account, this is indicative of Qinshi not having heaven's favor. So he did not receive the mandate of heaven. And with this historical context, you can imagine it was absolutely essential that an emperor prove his legitimacy by collecting. So these are the vessels that, from the Shang Dynasty onward, held these grains. There were 5 prestigious grains, millet being the most prestigious, and then 5 meats that also were used in the veneration of ancestors. Forward. The second emperor was actually the brother of Taizu, the founding emperor, and it's rumored, it was widely believed, that he had usurped the throne, that he had managed to actually execute his brother. So you can imagine he was particularly anxious to demonstrate that he had the mandate of heaven, that he was the legitimate ruler. And so there was a story that their mother on her deathbed said to the elder brother, the Emperor Taizu, "You must give the throne to your younger brother. It's better to have an adult than a child." This probably was an apocryphal story that was made up to defend his usurpation. But never mind, he was very able, not so much in military matters. He lost a couple battles, but he was terrific at collecting, at calligraphy, at establishing academies, at developing a little painting school, and not really an academy, but a workshop. And he was particularly interested in calligraphy. He himself wrote a flying white script that he then presented to his courtiers. But he also championed the 4 Wangs, the 2 Wangs. These were the 2 calligraphers in the 4th century who were felt to be the progenitors of calligraphy, the masters, the fathers of real calligraphy. And one of the Tang Dynasty emperors so loved Wang Shizhi's writing. You see Wang Shizhi's preface to the Orchid Pavilion on the left, that he took this preface to the Orchid Pavilion into his tomb with him. But above ground remained many copies and engravings of the Orchid Pavilion preface, and those were endlessly copied and reproduced so that there are many versions with subtle differences. Then the attention to calligraphy, the most prestigious of all arts, was not trivial at all. The written word represented a connection to the origins of civilization and the transmission of the foundational texts and precepts. So Chinese calligraphic characters were also felt to have a numinous power in communing with spiritual forces. So brush writing was examined for revelations of the writer's personality and moral stature. In 992, Emperor Taizong established calligraphy standards through a compendium called the Model Calligraphy in the Imperial Archives of the Chunhua era. It was carved into wood blocks and distributed in the form of rubbings to students and scholars. And the primary model was the balanced yet flexible style of the two Wangs that you see here. So Wang Xizhi and his son Wang Xianzhi. And then on the right you see Song Taizong's writing, his calligraphy, in Wang's style. As you know, Chinese calligraphy has a set stroke order, but you can do all kinds of things within that stroke order. And we'll see in a little bit what Emperor Huizong did at the beginning of the 12th century. Well, the Tang Dynasty had relied on aristocrats to man their huge bureaucracy. And the Song Dynasty, newly founded, didn't have that supply of aristocrats. So they established an examination system to try to find the best and the brightest. People had to, these were all men of course, had to learn the classics, had to be able to read them, recite them. They were sometimes given one 4-character passage, and they had to take those 4 characters and then copy out these subsequent passages based on that, and then add commentary. So not an easy thing to do. And so there were some very bright men who succeeded in this arduous competition. And there were unintended consequences from recruiting scholars this way. Some of them had very strong, independent minds. And they challenged the cultural norms that the court was trying to set. Some of those, like Ouyang Xiu, and then later the Su Shi and his followers, these luminaries of the 11th century, favored, rather than Wang Xizhi, they felt Wang Xizhi was too pretty, too suave. They wanted something that was more kind of honest and straightforward. And they chose Yan Zhenqing. If you have studied Chinese calligraphy, you have probably copied out the regular script of Yan Zhenqing. He has been taken ever since the 11th century anyway, as a model of calligraphic style, great calligraphic style. But they particularly admired his draft. There were 2 drafts that survived from the 8th century miraculously. And one of them was this draft where he criticized a general who so poorly managed an attack on a city on the northern border that his troops were wiped out. And one of those soldiers was Yan Zhenqing's nephew. He was furious at the ineptitude of that general, and so he wrote this essay criticizing the general. And one of the interesting things is that he says things like, "How incredibly stupid was that?" But then he'll cross it out and put something a little more gentle and politic. But this draft of a eulogy for his nephew inspired some of the calligraphers of the late 11th century. And I'll show you 2 examples. Huang Tingjian, Su Shi at the top, his very despairing essay on being alone in exile on the Cold Food Festival, one of those dates when you're supposed to be with family. And then Huang Tingjian in exile, again, in far-off Sichuan, writing a scroll for his nephew, Zhang Datong. So what to do when you have these independent-minded scholars? Well, clearly you exile them if they don't cooperate. You might spare them their lives, but you send them away. So there's a kind of ongoing cultural competition between these very strong and interesting scholars and the court. There's also in the 11th century a remarkable phenomena of women serving as regents for young emperors. This is one of the most remarkable, and she's the first one in the Song Dynasty to serve as a regent for a young emperor. This is Empress Leo, and she was of uncertain origin. She didn't have family behind her. She knew that everyone knew she came from Sichuan, but she was said to have been, the family originally came from Shanxi, from the Taiyuan area, and she at 40 still hadn't produced a son. So the emperor really appreciated her, liked her, but how could he make her an empress if she didn't have a son? So it seems that she arranged for one of her very compliant young maidens to serve in the emperor's quarters. She got pregnant, she had a baby, and immediately Empress Leo took over this little boy. And in mythology and later tellings, the young maiden, Miss Li, was told that she had given birth to a fox. So she could not, couldn't survive. So anyway, it's a really fascinating little story. But anyway, so this young man becomes the emperor, Renzong, when he's only 10 years old. And she serves as regent for 10 years and obviously loves it. She had been very helpful to her husband, Renzong, had been a very, the name Empress, the designation Empress, in fact, doesn't apply in China because empresses could never serve as head of state. It's unlike the British system or any of the systems that allow women to be rulers. So, in fact, it should be chief consort. But just out of custom, we can say Empress Leo. Okay, so she has an extraordinary set of makeup, an amazing crown, and this striking makeup that emphasizes her face and her long nose. She has a little black dot on her lip. This is a style of makeup that is known from the Tang Dynasty, but had fallen out of favor, but then she adopts it. And she, there's something else that's really striking about this. You see that her thumb actually sticks out from her sleeve. This was a custom of men greeting each other with their hands together. And this was strictly a male gesture. So for her thumb to stick out was already an indication that she was quite interested in being considered one of the guys, one of the boys. She actually she elicited incredible resistance from the court. She once wore the male imperial robes to a ceremony, was criticized for that. The only woman ever to take the name Empress was Wu Zetian in the Tang Dynasty, and she was widely condemned. So they accused her of trying to be Wu Zetian. Well, she actually, I think, had inclinations in that direction, but they kept her under control. But one extraordinary, and this is Renzong, as an adult, the young man who she adopted as her son. Oh, that's such an interesting story, too, when he learns that she's not his real mother. Won't go into that. But one extraordinary thing that Empress Leo did was build a great hall at Taiyuan. It's called Jinsi. It's so worth visiting. It's a magnificent hall in Song Dynasty style. Dates to the it can be dated to exactly when she was regent, really controlling the government. And it's a place where there are 3 springs coming out and providing water for that whole region, for the agriculture of Shanxi province. This is called the Sage Mother Hall. And the Sage Mother is enthroned right at the front of the hall. And you can see she is surrounded by a watery world. And she's also surrounded on the periphery by 42 attendants. And they are really unusual in Chinese sculpture. They're very realistic. They've been painted and repainted and gotten dirty and painted again, so one longs to have a really good conservation job on these pieces, but they are still incredibly beautiful. And to make them even more realistic, they have glass eyes, so they sparkle slightly as, excuse me, as you move around. You can see it's almost as if their eyes are following you as you move. So each one is a slightly different attitude, and you almost get the feeling that they're portraits. And I like to think that this very sweet, compliant gal at the far right is perhaps a portrait of Miss Li, who was kind enough to provide a son for the court. So there are also eunuchs among these 42 attendants, which reminds us that eunuchs were an absolute essential feature of running a household, in especially a large household in the palace, but also aristocratic households, because they could come and go, because they were castrated. They couldn't have sex with, or they could they could try to have sex. They could not get anyone pregnant. And they were absolutely critical in coming and going in the women's quarters, but also running errands outside the palace and liaisoning with artists oftentimes. So they were just an essential part of a household. So just towards the end of her life, her son does succeed to the throne, and then Empress Leo dies in 1033. But she set a precedent for a woman being a regent, and thereafter there were 8 other women in the Song dynasty who served as regents. So in the 11th century, women were actually in charge of the government for about 50 years, almost half of the dynasty, half of the century. Now, one of the great paintings, I can't do the Song dynasty without mentioning this painting, the Fan Quan in the Palace Museum Taipei, which is one of the monuments of Northern Song painting, and which says, this is the solid foundation of our dynasty. This is one of the great mountains. Mountains often in poetry and literature were compared to the state, and also were metaphors for great men who dominated the scene. It's a very imposing painting with a little group of figures making their way across a valley here. And the waterfall creates great mist in the valley, and we see that there's a temple poised on this promontory just opposite the waterfall. So there's obviously a sense of numinosity about this scene. And one of the other extraordinary things is that Fan Quan actually signed it in among the leaves. Paintings generally weren't signed, but his signature is here among the leaves. So this is an example of a court painting that is documenting success. This is saying our dynasty is stable. We have a wonderful, harmonious world. And then another painting that documents success is this one by Guo Xi, also in the Palace Museum, Taipei. Dated, not only signed, but also dated 1072. And it is signed right here, hanging from a little bit. Anyway, Guo Xi, and it says early spring. It gives the title. So this is one of those paintings that art historians love. This is painted 4 years after Shenzong comes to the throne. And he had a set of policies. They were called the New Policies, Xinfa. And it looked like they were succeeding tremendously well. What he wanted to do was increase taxation, bring more money into the coffers so that he could launch a war against a northern state and win back territory that had been lost. In 1072, the imperial coffers were looking very flush. And so this early spring might in fact be we know that Guo Xi was a court painter, and this might have been a compliment to the emperor that you are like the sun coming in the spring, warming the earth, providing nutriments, making things grow. Now, in terms of paintings that instruct, we have this wonderful painting of Meng Guang, the woman who is lifting the tray above her eyebrows as she serves her husband, a scholar, a lofty scholar. So this is a Han Dynasty story, and it is painted by Wei Xian. It's in the Palace Museum, Beijing. It's a lovely painting, but it, of course, has a very clear message. Women should serve men and do it reverentially. There was another painting that instructed women, and that was the Nu Shi Zhentu, the admonitions of the court instructress, which is in the British Museum and which came out of China at the time of the Boxer Rebellion and or maybe even early sacking of the Summer Palace. And a soldier, you know what they did after a big sack of a place? They assembled all the stuff that was looted, and then it was distributed to the troops. Sometimes in an auction. That's how British auction houses started. So a soldier brought it to the British Museum, not impressed by the painting, but wondering how much he could get for the jade clasp on the outside. So they cut off the clasp, gave it to him, and he was happy. I think he got maybe 8 pounds, I think they said. And they have had this as one of their great masterpieces ever since. I think it was 1903 when it came in, 1902, 1903. The important thing is that it's a very early painting. It's attributed to Gu Kaizhi. No one is quite sure if it's really that early, but it may be as early as the 7th century, maybe a little later. There was a 3-day conference held on this painting, and at the end of the conference, there was no agreement about the date, the century. But it's a fabulous painting. And here the instructress is writing with her brush in a book on the right, and there are 2 court ladies who are chatting to each other. And it tells the story of famous, legendary, and exemplary women, like the consort who, when a bear approached the emperor, quickly stepped up between the emperor and the bear, and only then did the soldiers come forth with their spears. So she's celebrated for having bravely protected the sovereign. Now, in terms of instructing and documenting and celebrating, no one could compete with the Huizong Emperor. He came to the throne in 1100, quite unexpectedly. He was born in the palace in 1082 to the Shenzong Emperor. He had no expectation of ever being emperor because he had elder brothers. But his older brother took ill and died in 1100. He was only 23 years old. And then Huizong's other older brother was disqualified because he had an eye ailment. So despite his protestations, no, he was made to be emperor. He was enthroned. Well, it wasn't long before he discovered this was not a bad thing to be. He actually warmed to being emperor. He at first tried to keep warring factions, not actually unlike the factions we have today, from ultra-conservative to more liberal, warring in our country, but in the Northern Sung, it had been going on for decades and was getting worse, and he was sincerely tried to get them to cooperate. That didn't work, and so he had to, he sided with the reformers, and that meant that the anti-reform faction, including Su Dongpo and Huang Tingjian, were declared criminals. He eventually made a list of 400 criminal officials, and they were not only were you not to read or circulate their writing, you were not to employ their sons or grandsons. But in terms of the arts, he was a fabulous mentor for many court painters. He was also very interested in reestablishing old rites that had gone out of use for centuries. And he volunteered that the court musicians could use the length of his finger digit to establish a new set of tones. And then, based on the length of his finger digit, this Da Sheng bell was cast and was used in ceremonies. The bell weighs 6.5 kilos, and it has a beautiful resonant tone, and so it was all declared a great success. Now, I mentioned his calligraphy. You will see that this is indeed a very striking example of regular script. He uses a very taut, a strong line, and there are always emphatic hooks or dots at the ends of his strokes. It's a very distinctive style of writing. And Maggie Bickford has observed that of those that are thought to be his calligraphy, there are maybe 5 different hands, subtle differences. And this is not surprising when you realize that, of course, he had substitute brushes, daibi. He had functionaries who learned his style of writing and who could inscribe a painting or copy out a text for him. But he often issued edicts in his own hand, and sometimes they were carved into stone with the belief that if it was in his own calligraphy, it would carry more weight. So there are a few examples still extant, and I just give you this one as a representative example. Now, Huizong was famously gregarious. He loved to give banquets. He loved to hold parties. He, of course, attended audience, and he read memorials, and he did his job as an emperor. He listened to his counselors. But what he really loved was to build buildings, to plan gardens, to build temples, and to host parties in his garden. Probably not competitive with what you had here last night, but this is one description of the atmosphere at his court from about 1107 to 1117. During this era, pure banquets filled the realm. The 4 barbarian tribes responded to these airs and came with knees bent to receive orders from the throne. The heavenly auras, generative and shrouding mists, were also of extraordinary shape and manner. There were no untoward affairs in or outside the court. And daily there were only discussions of the rites, music, and auspicious phenomena. One could say it was the ultimate glory of the great peace. And that was one of the names that he took in his, one of the reign names he took. So here you see a detail of this wonderful banquet in his garden with his courtiers and the preparations for the banquet in the foreground. This painting is in Palace Museum in Taipei. And it was inscribed by his favorite minister, Cai Jing. Now, you can see that, of course, Huizong would like paintings like this that are very colorful, very auspicious. But at these banquets, he also shared with his courtiers paintings in the collection. And we are not absolutely certain that this is the one that's listed in his Imperial collecting book, his catalog, but there is a Summer Mountains by a painter named Chu Ding, and this one, which is in the Metropolitan Museum, may be the one that he had. Whether it is or not, it is a wonderfully appropriate painting for Huizong and his court because it's so harmonious and entertaining. You can follow through it, you can travel through this landscape, and you could probably imagine even living here because there are lovely buildings tucked up in the valleys with beautiful views of the landscape. And the end of the scroll is quite extraordinary. This is typical of Song Dynasty landscape paintings, that you've come along, you're traveling through it, you make your way, you maybe come along this bridge, you come along this path, and then there's no way to go. You turn around and follow this guy back into the landscape. And this is what you can see in the detail. Here's the fellow that we just noticed, and he's walking along over this little bridge towards a building that is at the periphery of a village. So it has a local deity. And Huizong took a great interest in these local deities and cults, and banned some of them and supported others. But this is a rare example of a painting that shows someone who's put his parcels aside and has kneeled in front of the altar of that little shrine. Now, at the beginning of Huizong's reign, when he ascended the throne, he asserted the court's authority to propagate cultural standards, and he invited people to send in auspicious sightings, and they came in large numbers. But one painter actually came up with a wonderfully auspicious image for the Huizong emperor. This was painted in 1113 by a young painter who was only 18 years old. So it's a slightly naive painting, but you start at the upper right-hand corner and enter this long, long hand scroll that is in the Palace Museum, Beijing. And so you enter here and you travel along through it and then through this area. And once at the Palace Museum, this was completely unrolled and one could see the whole length of it, including at the very end an inscription here on an extra piece of silk by Cai Jing, the prime minister. Huizong so liked this painting that he gave it to Cai Jing, and it was as if you could say, this is what we have wrought, this is what we have accomplished. So in a sense, it is the success of the, just a second, I have some, no, maybe I don't, of the, of the court. I mentioned that mountains are an image for the state and also for a great man. And here you see a great compliment to the emperor. At this time that this was painted, or a few years before, there was a text already circulating by Guo Si that was later submitted to the throne. But one of the things that he says in his text is, "A great mountain is dominating as chief over the assembled hills. The general appearance is of a great lord, glorious on his throne, and 100 princes hastening to pay him court, without any effect of arrogance or withdrawal on either part." Because Guo Si was writing about his father's landscape painting and landscape in general, it's not too much of a stretch to think that Wang Ximeng, this young painter, might have taken that as one of his ideas for this hand scroll. Now, Huizong's call for propagating, submission of auspicious reports elicited a flood of auspicious reports. He sometimes awarded people, not every time, but sometimes he did. And that, of course, generated more interest in giving the emperor auspicious news. In 1103, this is one of the auspicious paintings. There was, the grand astrologer reported that 5 planets were moving in unison in the sky. And 1107, this is from Peter Sturman's article, the Yellow River, notoriously laden with silt, that's why it's called yellow, had mysteriously risen and cleared. For 7 days it ran clear. And then in there are many others, but in 1111 there was a magic brightly colored linger fungus that was discovered growing by the steps of the temple of the imperial ancestors. And that was interpreted to mean that the ancestors were grateful. That was the grateful response to the profundity of Huizong's filial piety. So these reports, Pat Ebry, one of the great authorities on Huizong, she's written 2 fat volumes on Huizong, says that he didn't actually necessarily believe all of these reports, although you get the feeling that he was drawn into them year by year, but he loved the pomp and the theater associated with the reporting of them, which was full court regalia and bells and chimes and various things that made it an exciting performance. The 5-colored parakeet was a little bird that was brought from the south of the Ling Mountains. So in his inscription describing it, his long inscription, first of all, just appreciate this beautiful little bird. He says that it came from the far south, it was tame, of noble bearing, and in keeping with the general association of these rare birds, capable of uttering many a fine speech. So these, can you imagine having a little bird come and then perch on your flowering tree in the garden? So he this is in Boston, and I'm sorry, left in Chinese from a class I gave at the Central Academy. But anyway, you can see that his writing details and is in this beautiful a slender gold script. And you will see from the others, this is another one of the auspicious events, the cranes over Kaifeng. In a long inscription next to it, he said, "Auspicious clouds suddenly formed in masses and descended about the main gate of the palace, illuminating it. Everyone raised their heads to gaze at them. Suddenly, a group of cranes appeared flying in the sky. 2 came to perch atop the owl tail ridge ornaments of the gate, completely at ease and self-composed. The others all wheeled about in the sky, as if responding to some rhythm. Residents of the capital, walking about, all bowed in reverence, gazing from afar. They sighed at length over the unusual sight. For some time the cranes did not disperse. Then they circled about and flew off, separating at the northwest quarter of the city. Moved by this auspicious event, I wrote the following poem to record its fact." So this happened in 1112, and we don't know if the painting was done in 1112. It might have been later, as Peter Sturman notes. But it's a beautiful painting, and here's the account and the poem that he wrote for it, and you can find that in your assigned essay, Cranes Above Kaifeng. Cranes, in fact, were tameable, and some scholars kept them as pets. And they would fly off for long times, and then some come back, and they loved to dance. Of course, the dance is often done at mating season, but these huge birds also responded to music. So sometimes they actually would dance just out of pleasure of listening to the rhythm. They could fly really high. These are Manchurian cranes. They have a wingspan of 2.5 meters. So they're very imposing birds, and beautifully marked with mostly white and then black tail feathers and that red patch on the head. So these cranes have enormous auspicious qualities. And also, because they live a long time, they could be thought of as birds that would enhance your longevity. In fact, in the Mawangdui Han Dynasty site, there was dried crane meat among the foods given to the deceased woman at Mawangdui. Okay, one other painting that is fascinating for its auspiciousness is this dragon rock. And it has a little inscription on it that says, what was it, magical dragon? Something like that. Anyway, seeing a dragon in a rock. And it's as if this could practically take off from its moorings in his garden. It's now thought that maybe all 3 of these were part of this huge project that Huizong had to document auspicious events and auspicious sightings. There were recorded 15 paintings in each volume, and in the end there were over 1,000 volumes. So you can imagine his court artists were very busy for a long time. The Boston painting that I showed you had its inscription on the other side. This is now mounted over on this side. But if you move it over, then it completely agrees in format and in measurements with the cranes over the palace gate and the dragon rock. So these may be 3 surviving one. Now finally, I want to tell you about Huizong is embracing the whole empire, but he didn't embrace all paintings done in his empire. And one of the fascinating things is the ink plum, which later becomes such a huge success in Chinese culture. But at the time of Huizong, what was his cataloging project does have some paintings with plum blossoms, but they're always in conjunction with other things. Shui mo hua, mei hua didn't exist. That is, ink plum blossom painting was not included in the catalog, even though ink bamboo was. This is probably because the plum blossoms in ink were an unnatural phenomena. That is, bamboo could be thought of as being dark, and so a inky stroke to make a bamboo leaf was quite acceptable. But to take a white flower and make it black was to turn things upside down, to make something black that should be white. And that is a Chinese phrase, hei bai dian dao, that resonated through the literati culture of the Northern Song, because people said to send Su Shi and Huang Tingjian into exile when they should be high officials, to condemn them, to call them criminals, was to take white and change it to black. These are quotations from the what has been called the manual of the dissident, the Songs of the South, the Chuzi, which was purportedly written by Qu Yuan. Never mind who wrote it. They're wonderful poems, and they have all kinds of sentiments that say, okay, I was loyal, I was honest, I was giving good advice, and I was rejected. That's the Qu Yuan trope. So the first recorded black plum blossoms, ink plum blossoms, were done for Huang Tingjian by a monk in Hunan province for the plum blossoms. And Huang Tingjian saw this and was so moved and excited, and they were both thinking of Su Shi, who was also exiled, and they were reading Su Shi's plum blossom poems. And so Hua Guang paints for Huang Tingjian writes poems and gives them to Hua Guang. So there's this wonderful moment where plum blossoms are a dissident image. Huizong and his courtiers find a way to reverse that. I won't go into detail, but ink dot plum blossoms are quite rare in subsequent centuries. But occasionally, if someone wants to really express their anger that things are wrong, society's wrong, I've been wronged, whatever, they can use these ink dots, which Bada Shanren did when he left the Sangha. He left the Buddhist Sangha, and in order to marry, to have a son to carry on his family's line, didn't work out. And then he painted that dramatic plum tree with black dotted blossoms. Well, Huizong made a very bad decision towards the end of his reign. He decided to break the long-standing treaty with the Khitan Liao and to make a new alliance with the Jurchen Jin. And Pat Ebry calls this the worst decision that Huizong ever made. The dynasty was threatened. Huizong abdicated to his eldest son, Qinzong, and we will take up the loss of the Northern Song after our break and talk about the Southern Song.